Now, I know a lot of you are aware that Chet Baker sang as well as played the trumpet, but I don't know how many people know that he could actually do both simultaneously.
I fall in love too easily.
Okay, joking aside, I'll come back to that in a minute. But first, if you're new to this channel, my name is Chase Sanborn and I'm a jazz trumpet player based in Toronto. I've been posting videos on YouTube for about 6 years. And the title of this one, What's So Great About Chet Baker, was one of my first videos, and it's continued to be one of the most popular. Over the years, there were a lot of comments on that video, and occasionally a person would take issue with the contention that Chet Baker was so great, in comparison to players like Clifford Brown, Freddie Hubbard, Lee Morgan, Kenny Durham, Booker Little, Nat Adderley, Clark Terry, and the list goes on. In my early formative years, those were the players that I most admired, and of course I still do. I paid some attention to Chet, and I transcribed a few of his solos, and you'll hear one of them in this video. But my deep appreciation for what he brings to the music came later in life, as things sometimes do. Ironically, I think the things about Chet's playing that took me a while to fully appreciate are the same things that extend his appeal beyond the core of jazz fans. I'd categorize them as the beauty of simplicity, the strength of fragility, and the preeminence of melody. Jazz can be a complex art form, as you well know if you're a jazz student like I am. Many of the great jazz musicians are virtuosos on their instruments, and they have a deep understanding of how to navigate the complexities of jazz harmony. What Charlie Parker played in 1945 remains monumental to this day. Bird's alter ego was Dizzy Gillespie, who was on a similar level of instrumental and harmonic acuity. But I think it's telling that Bird also chose to work with Chet Baker and Miles Davis, and I think it's reasonable to assume that in those two players, Bird was attracted to the idea of someone who complemented or contrasted rather than mirrored his style. Miles, of course, changed his musical style throughout his life, while Chet's remained consistent, rooted in the melodies of the great standard tunes. Chet was not a musical visionary like Miles, but he still had an outsized impact, especially considering the other things he was not. Although he could definitely play the trumpet, and he had a beautiful sound, his reputation wasn't built on virtuosity like some of the other players I mentioned. He didn't have a deep understanding of the theoretical aspects of music, in fact, quite the opposite. But he had a natural ability to understand and respond to what he heard. Here's what pianist Richie Beirach had to say about him.
Chet could read no music, nothing, and didn't understand harmony and didn't want to, didn't need to. His ear was the most developed I've ever seen from a non-jazz perspective. It's one thing to have an ear for simple chords, 2-5-1s moving through the key. He could hear progressions that were not 2-5-1s, that were contemporary sounds, Wayne Shorter tunes like Pinocchio or Infant Eyes, or my tunes like Broken Wing and Leaving. These tunes are not simple tunes. Chet breezed right through it.
This gets us to something that we've been talking about recently on this channel: how to approach improvisation in a way that's based at least as much on what we hear as what we know. There's irony in jazz pedagogy that's based on knowledge of chords and scales as we try to do something that Chet Baker did on a purely intuitive level. Chet had a love and a reverence for melody. He said that without that, music had no meaning for him. Many times I've said to students that the melody is probably the best thing that we will ever play on a given tune, because it provides a clear and concise pathway through the chords without any need for embellishment, and we're going to be hard-pressed to improve on that. The art of improvising over chord changes is to compose new melodies over an existing harmonic framework, but it's crucial that we do so with a pervasive awareness of the melody as the defining element of the tune. In the opening, I overdubbed a little of Chet's trumpet solo on top of him singing the melody for the tune I Fall in Love Too Easily. That recording is from the 1954 record Chet Baker Sings, which was his debut vocal recording. After Chet sings the melody, he plays a one-chorus trumpet solo, and if you layer one on top of the other, you wind up with a very well-crafted counterpoint. I can't play any more of the original recording because of copyright, and also because the solo and the melody won't stay in sync because they occurred at two different moments in time. But if I play Chet's solo at the same time that I play the melody, you can get a sense of how intertwined they are. I want you to listen especially for the points of resolution, where sometimes they wind up on the same note and at other times in harmony. But what is absolutely clear is that the melody is omnipresent in Chet's mind as he improvises. If Wikipedia is to be believed, Chet's pianist Russ Freeman and his wife were disdainful of that record, feeling that it didn't represent him as a jazz musician. But there's no denying the impact that his singing had on his popularity. And here's Chet talking about it in 1955, the year after the record came out.
Well, I think of myself as a trumpeter who sings, but recently a lot of people have been thinking that they like the singing better than the trumpet playing, so I don't know what to think now. With a vocal tune, they'll hear something that they've heard before. I think they like that a lot better a lot of times than hearing someone improvise on a tune that they're not too familiar with anyway.
Now, I find it kind of interesting to hear the self-doubt in Chet's voice, not knowing what to think about the fact that people seem to prefer his singing over his trumpet playing, which in his mind was his primary instrument. That situation, of course, is not unique to Chet. We can think of other jazz instrumentalists who became at least equally well known for their singing, people like Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, and Nat King Cole. In more modern times, maybe you could point to George Benson, Diana Krall, and Esperanza Spalding, among many others. In the case of all those musicians, you can hear that it's the same heart and soul coming through two different instruments, and that was especially true for Chet. As Richie Beirach put it, his trumpet sounded like he was whispering in your ear. Years ago, I had a trumpet student named Danny who was hired to play the part of Chet in a play titled Time After Time, The Chet Baker Project. The play wasn't about Chet specifically, but he was a central character. And the actor had to be able to play the trumpet, sing, and be good-looking, because of course Chet looked like a movie star in his younger years. Danny didn't really resemble Chet to my eyes, but he was good-looking, and he had done some singing in a rock band in addition to his trumpet playing, so he got the part. The show was a surprise hit, and additional performances were added to the schedule. Well, that tested the limits of Danny's vocal ability, and I remember him saying that he had to be diligent about his eating and sleeping habits in order to keep up with the demands. And the irony was not lost on either of us that Danny had to live a healthy lifestyle to emulate someone who had spent most of his life as a drug addict. Chet's addiction is well documented, and it made life hard for him and for some of the people closest to him. It was the fragile existence of a tortured soul, and that fragility manifested itself in his music. It's the raw humanity that you can hear in both his trumpet and his voice. People feel something when they listen to him. One would hope to reach those emotional depths without destroying yourself in the process. When my daughter was studying acting, she came home one day and she said she was at a disadvantage because her life had been devoid of exceptional pain or tragedy on which to draw. Now, as a parent, I'm glad she was spared that trauma, even if it handicapped her acting career. But the lesson is, the audience needs to feel something when they listen to our music, and for that to happen, we've got to feel something when we play, and that has to come through in our music. When we get too caught up in thinking about jazz improvisation, we are, perhaps, using the wrong part of our body. I mentioned that Chet's style was rooted in the melodies of standard tunes. Here's his solo on one of those, Autumn Leaves. This is from the 1974 album She Was Too Good to Me. I always recommend this album as a source for transcription material because Chet's solos exemplify the beauty of simplicity. In these 32 bars, I count 125 notes, and only 7 of them are outside the key of the tune, which we call non-diatonic. In a written transcription, you can recognize non-diatonic notes by the presence of accidentals. That means that almost 95% of the notes Chet plays are drawn from a single major scale. Coincidentally, that is almost exactly the same ratio of non-diatonic notes in the melody for this tune, and in fact the melodies of most standard tunes are largely and sometimes entirely diatonic. I should note here that in most of my jazz videos, I display music on screen in concert pitch because it's not only trumpet players who watch. But considering the focus and as a nod to the trumpet players, in this one I'm displaying in B-flat pitch. In general, I'm not a big fan of analyzing transcribed solos because I think that analysis after the fact doesn't reflect what was in the soloist's mind at the time. But in a solo that's almost entirely diatonic, it might be instructive to look at the few places where it ventures outside of the key, to see if we can explain why Chet's intuition led him to play those notes. I'm going to venture a little bit into the theoretical, and if what I'm about to say goes beyond your level of comprehension, well, hang in, because we won't be here too long and the summation will be simple. Plus, you can take heart in knowing that Chet might not have understood it on this level any better than you do. In the first line, we see one non-diatonic note, E natural. This is a chromatic passing tone between F and E flat, both of which are diatonic and also are chord tones on the F7 chord. In lines 2 and 4, we see almost exactly the same thing in 2 different octaves. Chet is playing an arpeggio based on a D7 flat 9 chord, starting on the 3rd and rising to the flat 9. In both cases, he winds up on the same 2 notes on beats 3 and 4, D and A. Autumn Leaves is a great tune for jazz students to work on because it goes back and forth between the major and relative minor key centers. In this case, it's B flat major and G minor, which share the same key signature of two flats. In both major and minor keys, the 5 chord is dominant. The 5 chord in B flat major is F dominant 7, and the 5 chord in G minor is D dominant 7. The third of these chords is what we call the leading tone because it leads to the root of the target chord. The third of an F dominant 7 chord is A, which leads to B flat. The third of a D dominant 7 chord is F sharp, which leads to G. The difference is that in a minor key, the third of the dominant chord is non-diatonic. It's what I refer to as a pivotal tone. That's an important chord tone that is outside of the key, and therefore it stands out to your ear and it begs to be played in a melodic line. As few non-diatonic notes as Chet plays, if you told him that he was not allowed to play the F sharp on the D7 chord, it would drive him crazy, as it would me or anyone who's versed in the jazz language. To find the next non-diatonic notes, we have to jump down to line 7, where we actually see 3 of them. The first is a repeat of what we've just talked about, the same arpeggio on the D7 flat 9 chord. The next is another example of a chromatic passing tone between two chord tones. C sharp leads from C to D. The third non-diatonic note in this line is another F sharp, but this time it doesn't occur on a D7 chord. Basically, the F sharp is a chromatic approach into the G that comes 2 notes later. But if we look at the notes that precede and follow it, B flat and A, we can see it as a 3-note enclosure that leads to the G. And this particular melodic pattern is very common. Finally, in the last line, the phrase in the second bar is based on the G blues scale. That's where the D flat comes from. The blues scale is often used to finalize a phrase, especially so in a minor key. Okay, that's the end of the jazz theory, and hopefully you're still with me. But the takeaway is that in a solo which is almost entirely diatonic, the few spots where it isn't can each be defined in one of 2 ways: chromatic passing or approach tones, or the major third of the dominant chord in the minor key. Now we'll take a look at another solo from this album on the song Tangerine. In this 2-chorus solo, he plays 241 notes, and 19 of them are non-diatonic. That's a 92% ratio of diatonic to non-diatonic notes. Now, if you'll abide one more theoretical intrusion, we actually see more than 19 accidentals in this solo. And that's because there are 4 bars in this tune in which the key center shifts from F major to A major. All of the accidentals that you see in those bars make his lines diatonic to the new key center. When you can recognize a group of chords that define a key center, that helps you to see the bigger picture of a tune. In this case, for those 4 bars, all you do is play in the key of A, and that's exactly what Chet is doing. Now, before the theory geeks howl in protest, and to be strictly accurate, it's really only in the key of A for 2 bars, because the next 2 bars provide a modulation back to the key of F. In the first chorus, Chet's phrase makes a definitive melodic statement in the key of A. In the second chorus, Chet plays into the modulation, and I would argue that the G sharp that he plays over the A7 chord is a rare example of his ear leading him astray. Now, I had to listen closely to make sure that's what he actually played because it's somewhat illogical in the context of the chords. Now, the wrong note, if we can call it that, is only an 8th note, and it leads to a note that does make harmonic sense. So I won't be surprised if I get pushback on the assertion that it was essentially a mistake. But in any case, it is an example of the melodic line taking precedence over the chords. Now, since I can't play the full recording on YouTube, I'll play this solo myself. When you strip a solo away from the accompaniment, you get a sense of how strong the melodic line is. And in a solo that's mostly constructed from only 7 notes, that puts your melodic skills to the test, and Chet was a master at finding those pathways. I hope you're finding this interesting, and if so, I want to let you know that this video is sponsored by me. And maybe you, if you've ever bought anything from my website, like this book, or maybe taken an online lesson, or even dropped a little cash in the tip jar by clicking the thanks button. Those are my sources of revenue, and they help to keep this channel going without selling paid courses or memberships. You can find out more and get in touch at chasesanborn.com. The link's in the description. But the most important thing you can do, and it's absolutely free, is to click the like button right now. And I thank you so much for doing that. I know that this has been a long video, and I want to wrap up by improvising something myself. The Tangerine backing track from Jamie Aebersold is in a different key and a different tempo. And that's actually good, because my goal is not to copy or imitate Chet, and I'd fail miserably if I tried to do that, but to draw inspiration from him, even as I rely on my own musical instincts. As you listen, please leave a comment and let me know what you think or feel about Chet Baker, or pretty much anything else that pops into your head.